He handed her a mop and told her to clean his floors. She smiled, took it, and said nothing. But when the truth finally came out, that one moment of arrogance cost him everything he had spent 30 years building. Some lessons arrive dressed in an apron. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or treated like you didn't belong, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave your jaw on the floor. Hit that like button now, subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. I want you to picture a man who hasn't slept in 4 days, not because he was sick, not because someone he loved was hurting, but because a cold, numbers-on-a-page conference room deal, had nearly slipped through his fingers. That is the kind of man Richard Cole had become, the kind of man who loses sleep over contracts but hasn't cried since the winter of 2009. He wouldn't even tell you what happened that winter. He'd just look away, and you'd know not to ask again. He came home that evening the way he always came home, without warning, without warmth, without anyone waiting at the door who actually wanted to see him. Just the sound of his own shoes on the marble floor, just the echo of a house that was too large for one person and had been that way for a very long time. His housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, was gone. Family emergency. The agency had sent someone temporary. He knew this because Felix had texted him 3 words: cover arranged, temporary. Richard had read it, pocketed his phone, and thought nothing more of it. People were logistics to him by then. Pieces on a board. You moved them where you needed them, and you didn't ask how they felt about it. He was halfway down the main hallway, jacket already halfway off, when he saw her. A young woman, standing quietly near the library, her back half turned, carefully straightening a row of books that no one in that house had touched in years. She was simply dressed, hair pulled back, no jewelry, no noise, just a calm, focused presence in a house that had forgotten what calm felt like. Richard stopped for exactly 1 second. 1 second, that was all the time he gave her. 1 second to take in everything he thought he needed to know. Young, plain clothes, in his house, doing a task. The conclusion came instantly, automatically, the way it always did for a man who had spent 30 years making fast decisions and calling it wisdom. He didn't say hello, he didn't ask her name, he didn't even fully look at her face. He simply said, "You missed a spot on the East Corridor, start there," and then he walked away. She stood still for a moment, and then, quietly, without a single word, she set down the book in her hand, smoothed the front of her clothes, and walked toward the East Corridor. I need you to hold that image for a moment, because that is where this whole story begins. Not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom. Not in some dramatic confrontation with raised voices and pointed fingers. It begins right there, in a hallway, in a quiet house, with a man who couldn't spare 1 second to see a human being standing in front of him. And a woman who decided in that same second that she had seen everything she needed to see. See? 3 days? That is how long Ivy Weston lived inside Richard Cole's world without him ever once wondering who she really was. 3 days of early mornings and late evenings, 3 days of silent hallways and untouched dinner tables. 3 days of being looked through like a window, present, functional, and completely invisible. And what breaks my heart most about those 3 days is not what Richard did. It is what Ivy never showed. She woke before sunrise every morning, not because the job required it, but because that is who she was. Someone who gave everything to whatever room she was standing in, even when that room didn't deserve her. She prepared breakfast that Richard ate standing up, already on a phone call, already somewhere else in his mind. He never once sat down. He never once said thank you. He simply consumed what was in front of him and moved on, the way a man moves through a train station, purposeful, hurried, and completely unbothered by everyone he passes. Ivy watched all of it, and she said nothing. On the second day, Richard's colleague Diana Fossey came to the estate for a late afternoon meeting. Diana was sharp in the way that genuinely intelligent women are sharp. Not loud about it, just quietly accurate about everything she observed. She passed Ivy in the kitchen doorway and stopped, just for a moment. She looked down at Ivy's hands resting on the counter, and something shifted behind her eyes. Later, sitting across from Richard in his study, Diana said it almost casually. "Your temporary girl? Her hands are wrong." Richard looked up from his papers. "What? No calluses? No roughness? Those aren't the hands of someone who has been doing this work for years?" Richard held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked back down at his papers. "Don't romanticize the help, Diana." Diana said nothing more, but she didn't look convinced. What neither of them knew, what they couldn't have known, was that Ivy was standing just beyond the study door when those words landed. She heard every syllable. Don't romanticize the help. She stood there in the hallway of a house that wasn't hers, holding a folded linen she had been about to deliver, and she heard herself reduced to a category. Not a person, not even a name, just the help. She looked down at her own hands then, and for just a moment, just one unguarded, heartbreakingly human moment, something moved across her face. Not anger, not tears, something quieter and sadder than both of those things. The look of a person who chose to step into an ordinary life, only to be reminded of exactly why ordinary people so often feel like they are disappearing. She folded the linen, she straightened her back, and she walked back down the hallway without making a single sound. Because that is the thing about a woman like Ivy Weston. She had been given every reason to speak, every justification to reveal herself and watch the room scramble. But she understood something Richard Cole had never learned in 54 years of living. Silence, chosen with intention, is not weakness. It is the most devastating power in the world. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone call came. Richard was sitting at his desk, reviewing acquisition documents, doing what he always did in the quiet hours of the day, working, just working, because work was the one language he had never struggled to speak. Everything else in his life had grown complicated over the years. Relationships, conversations, grief, but numbers and contracts and strategies, those had always made perfect, obedient sense. His private line rang, the one only 12 people in the world had access to. He answered without looking at the name on the screen. The voice on the other end was older, unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. It said simply and quietly, "Richard, it's Harold Weston. I'm trying to reach my daughter." Richard's pen stopped moving. Harold Weston, the ghost tycoon. A man whose name existed in the highest rooms of global finance like a rumor. Spoken carefully, respected completely, seen almost never. A man whose empire made Richard's look like a first draft. And he was calling Richard's private line, looking for his daughter. Richard said carefully, "I'm sorry, Harold. I'm not sure I understand. Why would your daughter be—" "Her name is Ivy," Harold said. "Ivy Weston, 26 years old. She asked to be placed in your household through the agency connection. I allowed it because she insisted. She does this sometimes. Steps out of her world to see how the other half lives. Or rather," a brief pause, weighted and deliberate, "to see how the other half treats people when they think no one important is watching." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Richard Cole had ever heard. He stood up from his desk slowly, the way a man stands when the floor beneath him has suddenly become uncertain. He walked out of his study, down the main hallway, past the library where he had first seen her, past the kitchen where Diana had noticed her hands, all the way to the east corridor. And there she was, Ivy Weston, daughter of Harold Weston, worth more on paper than entire city blocks, standing in his corridor, in her plain clothes, with a mop in her hands, doing exactly what he had told her to do on the very first night. He stood there in the doorway and he couldn't speak, not because he didn't have words, but because every word he could find felt shamefully small against the size of what he had done. Finally, he said it, quietly, almost like a confession. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Ivy set the mop down with a gentleness that somehow made it worse. She turned and looked at him, fully, directly, without performance or drama. And then she said the 7 words that I believe will stay with Richard Cole for the rest of his life. You didn't ask. Just that. Nothing more. 3 days. 3 full days inside his house, inside his world, inside the daily machinery of his life. And he had never once asked her name. Never once treated her like someone whose story might be worth knowing. He had looked at her and seen a function, a service, a temporary convenience, and she had seen everything. The weight of those 3 words filled that corridor like water fills a room, slowly, completely, leaving nowhere to stand that wasn't already submerged. Richard felt something crack open in his chest that no business loss had ever touched. Not embarrassment, not panic about the merger or the money, or what Harold Weston must think of him now. Something older than all of that. Something that had been sealed shut since that winter in 2009 that he never talked about. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely ashamed of who he had become. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a moment of genuine shame. Not the silence of awkwardness, not the silence of 2 strangers, with nothing to say, but the silence of a man sitting alone in a room he built with his own hands, looking around at everything he created, and realizing that somewhere along the way, he built it without a single window. No light coming in, no warmth, just walls, just structure, just the cold, impressive architecture of a life that had forgotten what it was supposed to feel like from the inside. That was Richard Cole at 9 o'clock that evening. He had called Diana after Ivy walked away from the corridor. He told her everything, his voice quiet in a way Diana had never heard before. Not the quiet of composure, the quiet of a man genuinely undone. When he finished, Diana was silent for a moment. Then she said almost gently, "I told you about those hands, Richard." He almost laughed. It came out as something sadder than a laugh. And then the line went quiet again, and neither of them said another word for a long time. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He knocked on a door before entering. Ivy was in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, looking out the window at the gray morning garden the way people look at things when their mind is somewhere else entirely. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply waited. He asked her, properly, formally, the way he should have asked on the very first night. "May I sit down?" She nodded. And that was how it began. Not with grand apologies rehearsed in a mirror, not with the language of business or negotiation, just a man sitting down across from another human being and finally, being present in the room. He showed her the East Wing that afternoon, the place he had forbidden every member of staff from entering for 6 years. She walked through the doorway slowly and stopped. The walls were covered in paintings, vivid, enormous, deeply alive, landscapes and portraits and abstractions in colors that felt like emotions given physical form. "Your wife," Ivy said softly. It wasn't a question. "She painted every single one," Richard said. "She died 6 years ago. I closed this wing the week after the funeral because I couldn't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I couldn't walk past them without feeling like I was failing her somehow, like I had turned into someone she wouldn't recognize." Ivy looked at the paintings for a long time. Then she looked at Richard. "You didn't turn into someone she wouldn't recognize," she said quietly. "You turned into someone you don't recognize. That's different. That one can still be fixed." And there it was. Not a verdict delivered from a boardroom. Not a judgment written in legal language. Just the truth, spoken simply, in a room full of paintings by a woman who had loved a man enough to leave color behind for him when she was gone. They talked for hours that evening, really talked. Richard admitted that efficiency had become his religion after his wife passed, that staying busy was the only grief he knew how to practice. Ivy told him about the merger her father had trusted years ago, about the 3,000 people who lost their jobs, about the way her father had wept at his desk, a man she had never seen cry before or since, because he had trusted a surface instead of a soul. "That is why I came here," she said. "Not to judge you, to know you. Because my father is about to trust you with something that belongs to real people, and real people deserve better than to be handed over to a man who sees them as furniture." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land. The next morning, Ivy called Harold. Richard sat across the room, still and quiet, looking at his own hands, perhaps for the first time noticing what was and wasn't written on them. Ivy spoke carefully into the phone. "He's not a good man yet, Papa, but he knows it. And in my experience, a man who knows what he is and wants to be different, that is rarer than money. That is rarer than almost anything." She paused, listening. Then she said, "Recommend the merger, but with one condition." She looked directly at Richard as she said it. "He meets every single person who works for him, every department head, every floor manager, every name on every payroll, face to face, and he learns every single one of their names." Richard didn't flinch, didn't negotiate, didn't reach for the language of compromise the way he would have reached for it a week ago. He simply nodded. And in that nod lived something that no contract could ever contain. The quiet, difficult, enormously human decision to become accountable, not to a board, not to a merger, not to the ghost of his reputation, but to the ordinary, irreplaceable dignity of the people who had been invisible to him for far too long. Karma, I have learned, rarely arrives as punishment. More often it arrives as a mirror, held up at exactly the right angle, by exactly the right person, at exactly the moment when a soul is just broken enough to finally see itself clearly. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what a person sees in that mirror is not the end of who they are, but the beginning of who they could still become. The morning Ivy left, it rained. Not a dramatic storm. Not the kind of rain that feels like the sky is trying to say something. Just a quiet, steady, gray morning rain. The kind that falls without apology and asks nothing of anyone. The kind of rain that simply exists, the way certain truths simply exist, patient and unhurried, waiting for you to finally stand still long enough to feel them. Ivy came downstairs with her bag packed the same way she had arrived, quietly, without announcement, without the weight of ceremony. She had folded every linen she had used, washed her cup, left the kitchen exactly as she had found it on the first day, as if she had never been there at all, as if the whole week had been nothing more than a breath held and then gently released. But the house felt different now. Anyone who has ever lost someone, even temporarily, even someone who was never truly yours to keep, knows exactly what I mean. The rooms don't change. The furniture stays where it is. The light comes through the same windows at the same angles. But something in the air shifts. Something quiet and irreplaceable has moved on, and the space it leaves behind is shaped exactly like the person who filled it. Richard was standing at the front door when she came down. He wasn't blocking her path. He wasn't reaching for words to make her stay or promises to make himself feel better about her leaving. He was simply standing there, present, open, undefended, in a way that I think was the most honest he had stood in any doorway for a very long time. He had made tea, 2 cups, set on the small table near the entrance, still steaming. Ivy stopped when she saw them, and something moved across her face. Not the careful, unreadable composure she had worn like armor all week. Something softer, something that belonged to a 26-year-old woman who had carried a very heavy responsibility into this house, and was only now, in this last quiet moment, allowing herself to set it down. They drank their tea without talking, and somehow that silence was the most complete conversation the two of them had ever had. All the things that didn't need to be said living comfortably in the space between two people who had finally learned to see each other. When the cup was empty, Ivy picked up her bag. Richard looked at her and said, not as an apology, not as a plea, but as something true and simple and long overdue, "Thank you for not quitting on the first day." Ivy smiled, and I want you to understand what that smile meant, because it wasn't forgiveness granted from a position of superiority. It wasn't the satisfied smile of someone who had won. It was something far more moving than either of those things. It was the smile of a woman who had walked into a cold house, absorbed its coldness without breaking, and was leaving knowing that she had quietly, permanently changed its temperature. Not for herself, but because some people are built that way, wired at the soul level to leave every room they enter just slightly warmer than they found it, even when that room never deserved their warmth to begin with. She looked at him one last time and said, "I thought about quitting. The East Corridor was genuinely filthy." And Richard Cole, for the first time in 6 years, in the house his wife had loved, standing in the hallway where he had once dismissed a woman without learning her name, laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and forgotten, the kind that sounds like a door opening that has been closed for a very long time. Ivy walked out into the rain without hurrying. She didn't look back, and Richard stood in the open doorway watching her go, the rain falling softly past the threshold he wasn't crossing, holding the ghost of a warm cup in both hands. I don't know if Richard Cole became a good man after that week. Transformation is slow and private, and it doesn't always finish what it starts, but I know he began. I know he walked into his offices the following Monday and asked his assistant for a complete list of every employee by name, all 412 of them. I know he started at the bottom of that list and worked his way up. I know that the first name on the list was a woman in the mail room who had worked for Cole Meridian for 11 years without ever once being acknowledged by the man whose name was on the building. Her name was Patricia. He learned it on a Monday morning in the rain. And somewhere across the city, I like to think that Ivy Weston felt it, that small, quiet shift in the universe that happens when a person finally chooses to be better, not for an audience, not for a merger, not because someone powerful is watching, but simply because it was right. Because it was long overdue. Because every single person, regardless of what they are wearing, what they are carrying, or what task they appear to be doing in any given moment, deserves to be seen, deserves to be known, deserves, at the very least, to be asked their name. She could have ended him with 2 words on the very first night. She chose not to, because Ivy Weston understood that the most powerful thing you can do to a person who underestimates you is let them. Let them show you exactly who they are. Let the silence do what confrontation never could. And then, when the moment comes, don't destroy them. Just hold up the mirror and let them see themselves clearly for the very first time. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt personal, felt familiar, felt like something you needed to hear today, please share it with someone who needs it more than you do. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me about a time you were underestimated and proved them wrong. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are just getting started. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it is worth staying for.